Dr. Gigi Matthews is professor and head of the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at Christian Medical College, Vellore. She is on the expert committee formulating WHO guidelines on multiple obstetric and perinatal issues. She is a recipient of multiple grants and is PI on large international multi-center randomized control trial that studied techniques of cesarean section, Coronis 1 and 2, coordinated by National Perinatal Epidemiological Unit and funded by Medical Research Council UK. Her department received the Scotch Gold Award for Intrapartum Initiative for Patient and Newborn Safety in a Busy Labour Room. These peripartum interventions, resulting in reduced perinatal mortality rates and birth asphyxia rates, were subsequently published in the BJOG. She facilitated a successful ASHA grant towards purchase of departmental labour room equipment for improving maternal and neonatal outcomes for the department. She is a passionate teacher and an astute clinician with over 50 publications to her credit. She will speak today on management of diabetes in pregnancy.
Greetings from the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. I'm conscious of the fact that I'm addressing an audience of physicians. At the outset, I'd like to thank all the organizers for giving me this opportunity to talk to you on diabetes in pregnancy and our experience. The spectrum of diabetes in pregnancy ranges from pre-gestational diabetes, which comprises only 5% of diabetes in pregnancy, and the major chunk, 95% of the time, is gestational diabetes. Since I'm addressing physicians, I should also remind you that unlike gestational hypertension, where with superimposed preeclampsia, there's threat to the life of the mother, there is no threat to the life of the mother in diabetes, even in pre-gestational diabetes. Having said that, in type 1, there are adverse outcomes in the mother, the neonate, and the fetus. In type 2, which is sometimes diagnosed in pregnancy, again, the mother could be affected. In gestational diabetes, which is 95% of the time, both the fetus and the neonate are affected, and there are very few complications in the mother. A reminder that gestational diabetes would actually be type 2 diabetes diagnosed in pregnancy for the first time. There is no controversy in the management of type 1 diabetes mellitus. Key to optimum outcome is good periconceptional glycemic control, HbA1c less than 7. Treatment is always with insulin. There's increased chance of fetal anomalies, especially in type 1 and some type 2, when the HbA1c is more than 10. There is no role for termination of pregnancy despite a high HbA1c value. There's only a role for counseling. Women are counseled and they make an informed choice and are encouraged to have a 20-week morphology scan before we make any decisions regarding congenital anomaly. Just for completion, the maternal adverse outcomes range from gestational hypertension and preeclampsia, which is the commonest. And then, of course, we have uncommon end organ damage, which you physicians would normally have cases referred to. Each of these cases would need to be addressed in a case-by-case manner, very rare in pregnancy. Of course, the other adverse outcomes would be uncontrolled sugars and ketoacidosis, infections like UTI, puerperal sepsis, and minor infection like fungal infection. An increased operative delivery is seen across the board, both with uncontrolled gestational diabetes with macrosomic babies and type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Now, the management of gestational diabetes would be covered under 4 major headings, and definition. The definition is carbohydrate intolerance first identified in pregnancy, and we know there are problems with this definition. And I'm sure over the years this will evolve. And diagnosis has had major changes in the last decade due to several landmark studies, and I'll be alluding to all these studies subsequently. The adverse outcomes is usually a formidable list seen in any textbook, But the advantages of ensuring that you look at primary outcomes of large studies is that you can look at outcomes that are significant, and that is what we will be doing in the course of this talk. And treatment, of course, will follow soon after we've covered adverse outcomes. Now, as I said, diagnosis, the landmark study, the HAPO study, has made a major impact on the diagnosis of gestational diabetes in the last decade. In fact, we only had 5 to 10% of gestational diabetes till about a decade ago, but now with the new criteria, which evolved from this HAPO trial, we almost have 30% of gestational diabetics. Now, the HAPO study, historically, Pedersen in 1958 showed that women with uncontrolled sugars had stillbirth. But subsequently, we realized that these stillbirths were rare, and women with very high uncontrolled sugars were also rare. But then O'Sullivan and Mahan used criteria which then were modified by Carpenter and Kuster, and subsequently modified by National Diabetic Data Group. And we used, for the longest time, we used a 100-gram GTT with values 95, 180, 155, and 140 for the very long time to diagnose gestational diabetes. But however, they realized that this was not based on the adverse outcomes associated with these criteria, but with just a 2 standard deviation of general population. And therefore, HAPO study was designed to clarify the risk of adverse outcomes associated with various degrees of maternal glucose intolerance, less severe than overt diabetes. This was a large study. It was a cohort, 25,500 pregnant women, 15 centers, 9 countries. All of them had 75-gram glucose at 24 to 32 weeks, and their data was blinded if the fasting was equal to or less than 105 and equal to or less than 2 hours 200. And this blinded data divided into 7 categories, predefined categories. The categories range from fasting less than 75 to 105 into 7 categories. And the primary outcomes were birth weight above the 90th percentile of gestational age, primary cesarean section, neonatal hypoglycemia, and cord blood serum C-peptide. Now, if you look at this, the first 2 are related. If the birth weight is more than 90th percentile, and they obviously had an increased cesarean section, and if there was neonatal hypoglycemia, the cord C-peptide value was high. Cord C-peptide is usually used instead of looking at insulin assay because it's a more stable component, and it is equimolarly seen for every molecule of insulin. There's an equal molecule of C-peptide, and therefore this was the primary outcome. The secondary outcomes were preterm delivery, shoulder dystocia, need for intensive neonatal care, hyperbilirubinemia, and preeclampsia. So these outcomes also tell you that these were the most important adverse outcomes in gestational diabetes. This very complicated graph is actually very simple. It's a graphic representation of all the primary outcomes with glucose categories in the x-axis. So it was obvious that the higher the glucose category, the higher the chance of all the primary outcome. So why HAPO data was important? The number of study subjects dwarfs the number of participants in other studies. The maternal glucose concentrations were completely blinded, and they underwent no non-study glucose testing. So with every increase in standard deviation in maternal glucose concentration, increased the cesarean section rate, and with each standard deviation increase in maternal glucose concentration, there was increased risk of shoulder dystocia by 0.25%. But they also found that with each standard deviation decrease in maternal glucose concentration, there was an increase in the risk of small gestational age. So over-enthusiastic correction also had a problem. The drawbacks of the HAPO trial were that it did not give us clear guidelines or cutoff values for diagnosis of gestational diabetes. It only raised more questions. And there was a continuum of risks without clear threshold. So therefore, the world experts got together and came up with recommendation in 2010. And this recommendation has stood the test of time. And over the last decade, several people have challenged these recommendations, have done studies only to prove that they are good and good guideline to go by. And therefore, we now come with a robust criteria, 92, 180, 153. Over diabetes, important to know, we always have patients who are surprised by their glucose values. When the glucose fasting value is more than 126 milligram and the random blood glucose is more than 200 milligram per deciliter, they probably have type 2 diabetes diagnosed in pregnancy for the first time. Now, management. Should mild hyperglycemia be treated? There were two landmark studies which you should all be aware of. One was in 2005, there was a randomized controlled trial that looked at the effect of treatment of gestational diabetes on pregnancy outcomes. And the serious complications of composite outcome of this was taken as their primary outcome: perinatal death, shoulder dystocia, bone fracture, nerve palsy. And they found that there was a definite decrease with treatment of all these complications. The number needed to treat was 43, but there was no decrease in the cesarean section rate. Another study done soon after this was a multi-center study done in the US, published in the NEJM. They had 958 women, 470 in each arm, and they showed there was no difference in the primary outcome. And the primary outcome here was gestational age, hypoglycemia, hyperbilirubinemia, stillbirth, and birth trauma. But the secondary outcome, which were maternal outcomes, there was significant decrease in the treatment group. So therefore, it was very clear that management was definitely required even for milder forms of gestational diabetes. Having said that, it is quite a challenge. As we found now with the criteria, 30% of our women have gestational diabetes, and so all of them have to have medical nutritional therapy. So management is basically medical nutritional therapy in 75% of women, oral hypoglycemic agents in another 20%, and insulin in 5%. Medical nutritional therapy is still evolving. Since it's so important now, we are finding small studies that have shown low glycemic index diets are acceptable. But having said this, a lot of work has to go into medical nutritional therapy. Just for completion, I would like to say that we generally give our pregnant women 1,200 to 1,500 calorie diabetic diet, though there's a calculation of ideal body weight and 30 calories for every kilo for the ideal body weight. We generally do not give them diets that are less than 1,200 calorie. And the distribution of the diet is 40% of carbohydrate, 40% of fat, and 20% of protein in 3 main meals and 3 small meals. Medical nutritional therapy, as I mentioned before, is successful in 75% of our women. The women who are not controlled solely with medical nutritional therapy have to go on to other modes of management. The concerns of oral hypoglycemics were that there were limited experience, limited literature, doubts about teratogenicity, prolonged neonatal hypoglycemia, and whether they crossed the placental barrier. But the advantages of insulin is that the compliance is so much better. The risk of hypoglycemia is less, especially with metformin. There's less insulin resistance and less expensive. So in a developing country, it's a no-brainer. Oral hypoglycemic agents for those 20% of women should be offered, and there should not be any controversy. Overview, it's only correct that there's an overview of evidence for use of OHA in pregnancy in this talk. And so I will tell you that before 2000, for about 30 years, the researcher called Coetzee in Africa had been watching several of their women who refused to have insulin and who were on oral hypoglycemics and found there were no problems. So he had several publications. But having said that, the comparison of glyburide with gestational diabetes published in the NEGM, a landmark study, helped us make this decision to start the oral hypoglycemic treatment in pregnancy. I still remember our head of department in 2000 having a chat with the medicine head of department and looking at this study very carefully and wondering whether it was adequately powered to change practice, and we decided to change practice. But having said that, it was done surreptitiously. For the longest time, we used to coach our undergraduate students to say, no, oral hypoglycemia is a mode, but there is no evidence. Every patient that was started on glyburide, the neonatal outcomes were watched very carefully, and the neonatologists were happy after about 5 years, and they were more familiar with the use of glyburide in pregnancy. You look at the outcomes, they were very similar. But having said that, glyburide, the main outcomes that they looked at were hypoglycemia, hypocalcemia, hyperbilirubinemia, and there were very few cases of stillbirth. But a composite outcome seemed to be adequately powered, and we realized a study larger than this may not be possible, may not be easily done. This study showed that 4% of women on glyburide had to switch to insulin. There were no episodes of severe hypoglycemia in either group, and preeclampsia and LSCS in both groups were similar. Subsequently, metformin, known to be a better hypoglycemic agent, was then trialed in a large study which was published in 2008, and we soon slowly started switching to metformin. But before that, the results showed that the results of this study showed that there was definite improvement with the use of metformin. There were advantages of the use of metformin in pregnancy. And during the same time, we decided in 2007, we decided to compare neonatal outcomes in women with gestational diabetes with moderate hyperglycemia, and the women on metformin were compared with the women on glibenclamide. It was an open-label randomized controlled trial. It started in 2007, and having mentioned to you that people were not comfortable with oral hypoglycemic agents, we had to get the patients to sign a 3-page consent form, and for obvious reasons, a lot of them decided not to participate in the trial. After about 6 years of hard work, we decided to call it a day, and decided to publish it because we decided it was not possible to recruit any more women. And of course, we were in for a large surprise. We saw neonatal hypoglycemia much less common in the metformin group, and this was published in the Australian New Zealand Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. We struggled to publish this because those were early days of CTRI, and we didn't have prospective CTI registration. We only had retrospective registration. But the Australian New Zealand Journal, which is also a group of researchers who were responsible for looking at metformin and pregnancy, were very keen on having this published because these results were very similar to what they had seen. The primary outcome, if you can see, the composite outcome was statistically significantly better in the metformin group, and hypoglycemia is what actually contributed to this, and that also was significantly higher in the much lower in the metformin group. This cohort of about 140 odd women were followed up. We had a follow-up rate of only about 50%, and we found some significant findings. This was published this year in the International Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. We found no significant difference in the offspring and the women in both groups. 50% to 75% of women were diabetic, and the rest were pre-diabetic. And this was a very significant, it was an eye-opener. 9 years after our study, 50 to 75% of women on oral hypoglycemics were diabetic. Only 8 to 10% of offsprings were pre-diabetic, and only one diabetic, and that was reassuring. The BMI of our offspring was the average BMI was about 18, and the adult 28. The women, the average age of our women were about 38 to 39 years. So the dosage of metformin, 500 to 1 gram twice a day after food. We tailor it. We start off weekly for those fasting to ensure glycemic goals of fasting 60 to 90, pre-meal 60 to 105, postprandial 140, postprandial 2 hour 120. And as I'm speaking to physicians, you should know that after 37 weeks, for uncontrolled sugars, we always consider delivery. And well controlled on medical nutrition therapy, we always treat like normal pregnancy, because we don't want the sudden increase of 30% diagnosis of gestational diabetes, adding to our burden of management of induced patients in labor. And so well controlled on MNT will be treated like normal. Intrapartum care. Target is less than 140 milligram per deciliter. Women, you must remember that you should advise omitting the morning dose of insulin or oral hypoglycemic agent. A sliding scale of insulin, if glucose value is equal or more than 140 was seen, we use the sliding scale of insulin. And I didn't cover insulin, management of insulin, because I realized that you are familiar with this. Women, before I go on to postpartum care, I'd like to also mention to you that when there's diagnosis of overt diabetes, we definitely consider starting with insulin, and we may use metformin. But diagnosis of overt diabetes during pregnancy, insulin is the choice of drug. Postpartum care is evolving. As I said, our study showed a 75% chance of women developing gestational diabetes. Monitoring these women is paramount. So we use criteria which you are very familiar. More than 126 fasting and more than 200 is overt diabetes. 100 to 126 fasting and 140 to 200 as pre-diabetic. As I said, the guidelines for postpartum care are only evolving. Thank you.